The crystal formations of Blue's legs shattered like ice under a hammer. She tried to move, but her body only responded with waves of pain that made her vision blur. Around her, plasma fire lit up the dark purple sky of this forsaken planet. Her unit was retreating, their crystalline forms glinting in the dim light as they ran from the enemy's surprise attack. Unit 7, wait, Blue called out, her voice crackling like breaking glass. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. The rules were clear. No warrior who couldn't walk could be saved. A broken crystal was a useless crystal. That's what they always said. Blue watched as the last of her fellow warriors disappeared over the ridge. Their footsteps faded away, leaving her alone with the sound of distant explosions and the howling wind. She looked down at where her legs should have been. Instead of the proud, transparent crystal structures that had carried her through countless battles, there were only jagged stumps that sparkled uselessly in the dirt. The enemy's plasma weapons had known exactly where to hit. The crystalline people of her world were strong, but they had weak points. Heat concentrated in the right place could shatter their lattice structure in seconds. Blue had seen it happen to others before, but she never thought it would happen to her. She tried to drag herself behind a nearby rock as enemy fire continued to rain down around her. Each movement sent sharp pains through her remaining crystal structure. The ground beneath her was rough and hot. This planet's surface never truly cooled, even during its brief nights. Blue knew she had maybe 6 hours before the next heat cycle began. When it did, the ground would become hot enough to crack her remaining crystal body. Using her arms, she pulled herself into the shadow of the rock. Her universal translator was damaged, spitting out random words in different languages before falling silent. Not that it mattered anymore. No one would be coming to talk to her, let alone help her. More explosions lit up the sky. The enemy was getting closer. Blue could feel their heavy vehicles through the vibrations in the ground. She reached for her weapon, but found only empty air. It had been destroyed along with her legs. The proud warrior who had led countless victories was now nothing more than a broken crystal waiting to be crushed. Blue looked up at the strange stars of this border world. She had fought here for 3 cycles, defending the frontier against both the enemy and the humans who kept pushing into their space. The humans were strange creatures, soft and flexible, always changing, always breaking the rules. Her people had eventually formed an alliance with them, but no one really trusted these beings who could lose parts of themselves and still grow them back. The ground trembled more strongly now. Enemy scouts would be here soon. Blue's crystal body reflected the purple light of the sky, making her an easy target. She tried to remember the songs of her people, the ones they sang when preparing to join the great crystal matrix in the sky. But all she could think about was how she had failed. A sound made her freeze. Something was moving nearby, something trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Not the heavy stomp of the enemy, but something lighter. Blue held her breath, though she knew it was pointless. In the dim light, her crystal body would give her away instantly. The footsteps came closer. Blue closed her eyes, preparing for the end. She would not beg. She would not shame herself or her people any more than her broken body already had. The footsteps stopped right behind her rock. "Holy shit," a voice said in that strange, soft way that humans had. "Are you still alive?" Blue's eyes snapped open. Standing over her was a human in dark combat gear, his soft face covered in dirt and what looked like blood. He had a weapon, but it wasn't pointed at her. Instead, he was already kneeling down, pulling something from his pack. "Don't move," he said, though Blue couldn't have even if she wanted to. "I'm going to help you." Blue wanted to tell him that her people didn't accept help, that a broken crystal was meant to be left behind, that he was breaking every protocol of their careful alliance. But her translator was broken, and all she could do was watch as this strange, soft creature began to change everything she had ever known about how the universe worked. The human worked quickly, pulling out bandages and what looked like scanning equipment from his pack. Blue tried to move away, but each slight movement sent shards of pain through her crystalline form. Her body made a sound like cracking ice, and the human immediately put a hand out. "Easy there," he said, his voice low and careful. "Name's Jack. I'm a Marine Scout. Your translator working." Blue shook her head, the movement making tiny crystal chimes. She pointed to the damaged device near her neck, then made a braking motion with her hands. The human, Jack, nodded in understanding. "Well, that makes things harder," he said, mostly to himself. He pulled out a small device and started scanning her shattered legs. "Never thought I'd be giving first aid to a shimmer." They didn't exactly cover crystal biology in basic training. A distant explosion lit up the sky, making them both look up. Jack's face grew serious as he checked something on his wrist computer. "Enemy forces moving this way. We got maybe 20 minutes before their scouts reached this position." He looked at Blue, then at her missing legs, then back at his computer. "I'm supposed to be mapping their movements. Not." He trailed off, running a hand through his short hair. Blue understood his dilemma. He had a mission. She was not part of it. She was broken, useless, a burden. She waved her hand at him in what she hoped was the human gesture for "go away." It was better this way. One warrior's death meant nothing in a greater war. But Jack wasn't leaving. Instead, he was pulling more things from his pack, laying them out in an organized pattern. "Can't leave you here," he said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "They'll either kill you or worse, take you prisoner for intel." He picked up what looked like a temperature regulator. "This should help keep your crystal structure stable during the heat cycles. Not perfect, but better than nothing." Blue watched in confusion as this soft creature worked to save her. Among her people, such help would be seen as the greatest insult. To be helped was to be weak. To be weak was to be worthless. She tried to push his hands away when he started attaching the regulator to her remaining crystal structure, but he gently caught her wrist. "Look," he said, meeting her crystalline eyes with his strange, wet ones. "I know your people have rules about this stuff, but where I come from, we don't leave anyone behind. Not even allies we barely understand." Another explosion, closer this time. Jack worked faster, pulling out a combat tarp and some kind of frame from his pack. Blue realized he was building a makeshift shelter. The sun would be rising soon, bringing with it the deadly heat cycle of this planet. Without her legs, she couldn't regulate her temperature properly. She would crack and shatter in the first hour of daylight. Jack seemed to understand this too. He set up the shelter with practiced moves, then started rigging some kind of cooling system inside it. "It's not pretty," he said, "but it should keep you stable until we figure something out." A high-pitched whine filled the air. Enemy scouts. Jack immediately dropped into a combat stance, weapon ready. He positioned himself between Blue and the direction of the sound. It was such a strange thing to see. This soft, breakable creature standing guard over a broken crystal warrior. The whine grew louder, then began to fade as the scouts passed by on a different path. Jack let out a breath, then turned back to Blue with what she had learned was called a smile. "Okay," he said, "first problem solved. Now we just need to figure out how to get you mobile." He looked at her damaged crystal structure thoughtfully. "I've got some crazy ideas, but you're probably not going to like them." Blue looked at this human who defied everything she had been taught about how warriors should behave. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't following protocol. He was just helping. For the first time since her legs had shattered, she felt something new growing in her crystal core. She couldn't name it yet, but it felt strangely like hope. The planet's purple sky turned black as its 3 moons rose. Jack finished securing the makeshift shelter just as the temperature began to drop. Unlike the deadly heat of day, the night brought bitter cold that could crack crystal just as easily. Blue watched him work, still struggling to understand why this human wouldn't just leave her behind. Jack had rigged the shelter with both heating and cooling systems stolen from his own gear. He'd even torn up his spare uniform to create insulation. Now he sat at the entrance, checking his weapon while keeping watch. Blue could see the exhaustion in his soft features, but he didn't complain. A sound echoed across the rocky ground, a high-pitched screech that made Jack's head snap up. "What was that?" he whispered, raising his rifle. Blue recognized the sound. She pointed to herself, then made a walking motion with her fingers, then showed her teeth. Jack's eyes widened. "Right. Local predators. And they hunt crystal beings like you." Blue nodded. Her people's crystalline bodies gave off a faint light that the planet's native hunters could track. Without her legs, she couldn't run or fight. She was easy prey. She gestured at Jack to leave again, but he just shook his head. "Not happening," he said, checking his ammunition. "But you could help me understand what we're up against." He pulled out a small notebook and pencil, then drew a quick sketch of what looked like a question mark. Blue understood. He needed information. Using hand signals and drawings in the dirt, Blue explained about the night hunters, massive creatures with diamond-hard claws that could scratch even crystal skin. They hunted in packs, using the cold night to their advantage when crystal beings were slower and more brittle. As if summoned by their discussion, a dark shape moved just outside their light's reach. Jack went completely still, his rifle trained on the movement. Blue could feel vibrations through the ground. There were more creatures circling them. The first hunter launched itself at the shelter without warning. It was a massive thing, all claws and teeth, but Jack was ready. His rifle cracked 3 times, and the creature fell. But its pack wasn't far behind. 2 more shadows rushed in from different directions. Blue felt useless, unable to fight. But then she noticed something. Her crystalline body was reflecting Jack's weapon light, creating confusing patterns that seemed to disorient the hunters. She moved her arms deliberately, sending bright reflections across the darkness. Jack caught on immediately. He adjusted his position, using Blue's crystal form as a makeshift light weapon. The hunters hesitated, confused by the strange flashing lights. It gave Jack the opening he needed. His rifle spoke again, and another hunter fell. The rest of the pack retreated, their screeches fading into the night. "That," Jack said, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready, "was some quick thinking." He smiled at Blue, who found herself wanting to return the gesture, though her crystal face couldn't quite manage it. Instead, she tapped her chest and then pointed to him, trying to convey her thanks. "We make a good team," Jack said, understanding her meaning. He checked the shelter's systems again, then pulled out some ration bars from his pack. He offered one to Blue, then remembered. "Right, crystal biology. You probably don't eat these." Blue shook her head, then pointed to the ground. Jack watched curiously as she pressed her remaining crystal structure against the rocky surface. Her body began to absorb trace minerals, the way her people had evolved to feed. Jack's eyes widened with interest. "Learn something new every day," he said, taking a bite of his own ration bar. "You know, if we make it through this, the xenobiologists are going to have a field day studying how your people work. That is, if your people ever let them." Blue looked away. Her people rarely shared their secrets with others. But this human had already rejected so many rules to help her. Maybe some rules were meant to be broken. She reached out and touched Jack's arm, then pointed to his notebook. He handed it over, and she began to draw the basic structure of crystal biology. Through the long night, as Jack kept watch and Blue drew, they created their own language of gestures, drawings, and shared danger. And somewhere in the darkness, both of them knew that they were breaking down walls that had stood for generations. Morning came with its deadly heat, but Jack's makeshift shelter held. As the sun rose, he worked on something new. A transport system made from his combat gear and pieces of fallen equipment scattered around their position. Blue watched him strip down his own armor, using the sturdy plates to create what he called a travois. "It's not pretty," Jack said, testing the strength of his creation, "but it should keep your crystal structure off the hot ground." He had lined the makeshift sled with cooling units from his suit, leaving himself with minimal protection from the environment. The human base is about 30 miles south. We can only move at night, but we should make it in 3 days. Blue touched the travois, then pointed to Jack's now limited armor. She shook her head, trying to convey her concern. Jack just shrugged. I'll manage. Humans are tougher than we look. He checked his map projection, frowning at something on the display. Problem is, we've got enemy patrols between us and the base. And he hesitated. A familiar sound made them both freeze, the distinct hum of crystal transport vehicles. Blue's own people were out there too. Jack looked at her. They're searching for survivors, aren't they? But not to rescue them. Blue nodded slowly. Among her people, warriors who lost battles were left behind. But those who survived being left behind, they were hunted down. A broken crystal who lived was considered a shame to the entire species. She had known this law all her life, had even helped enforce it. Now she was its target. Jack's face hardened as he understood. Right. So we're avoiding 3 different groups who want us dead. Just another Tuesday. He checked his remaining ammunition. We've got 2 hours until the heat peaks. Then we wait for nightfall and move. The day passed slowly. They took turns watching, though Blue felt useless without her weapon. But she could still use her crystal structure to reflect light signals, warning Jack when she spotted movement outside. They developed a simple code: 1 flash for her people's patrols, 2 for enemy forces, 3 for the native predators. As the sun finally set, Jack helped Blue onto the travois. The first movement sent spikes of pain through her shattered crystal structure, but she made no sound. Jack noticed anyway. He adjusted the cooling units, trying to make her more comfortable. Ready? He asked, picking up the handles of the travois. Blue flashed her crystal form once for yes, something that made Jack smile. See, we're getting better at this communication thing. They moved through the darkness, Jack pulling the travois while constantly scanning for threats. Blue kept watch behind them, her crystal form carefully dimmed, but still able to signal if needed. The moons cast enough light to travel by, but also enough to expose them if they weren't careful. 2 hours into their journey, Blue flashed twice. Enemy patrol. Jack immediately pulled them into a shallow cave, using his remaining thermal blanket to cover Blue's crystalline glow. They waited, barely breathing, as heavy vehicles passed nearby. That was close, Jack whispered once the sound faded. You know, for someone who's supposed to be a burden, you're pretty good at keeping us alive. Blue looked at him sharply. In their time together, she had learned to read his expressions better. There was no mockery in his face, only honest appreciation. It went against everything she had been taught about weakness and strength. A distant explosion lit up the sky. The war was still raging somewhere out there. Jack checked his map again. We need to move faster. That fighting's going to draw patrols from all sides. He looked at Blue. This is going to hurt, but we need to cross that ridge before dawn. Blue straightened herself on the travois, then flashed once. Yes, she could handle pain. What she wasn't prepared for was how Jack then started talking to her in a low voice as he pulled, telling her stories about his home on Earth, about oceans and rain and things her crystal people had never understood. He was trying to distract her from the pain, she realized. Such consideration was alien to her, but somehow more precious than any battle honor she had ever earned. The last cooling unit died with a quiet whine. Jack tapped it desperately, but the light had gone dark. They had 2 more nights of travel ahead. And now Blue's crystal structure was at risk of cracking in the heat. Their water was almost gone too. Jack had used the last of it to cool Blue's crystal form during the previous day's heat. We'll figure something out, Jack said, though his voice was rough from thirst. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since finding Blue, and it showed. His face was sunburned, his uniform torn and dirty. But he kept going, pulling the travois through the rough terrain. Blue watched him stumble again, catching himself before he fell. She flashed her crystal structure 3 times, their signal to stop. Jack shook his head. We need to keep moving. Dawn's coming in 4 hours. She flashed 3 times again, more insistent. This time, Jack listened, lowering the travois carefully behind a cluster of rocks. He practically fell as he sat down, his hand shaking as he checked their surroundings. Blue reached out, touching his arm to get his attention. Then she pointed to his chest, made a sleeping motion, and pointed to herself. She would watch. Jack looked ready to argue, but exhaustion won. 1 hour, he mumbled, propping himself against a rock with his rifle ready. He was asleep in seconds. As she watched over him, Blue thought about the warriors who had trained her. They had taught her that the soft races were weak, that humans especially were too emotional, too willing to risk themselves for others. Watching Jack sleep, she finally understood. They had been wrong. There was strength in his softness, power in his willingness to help. A sound woke Jack exactly 1 hour later. His military training was automatic even in sleep, but the sound wasn't danger. It was a quiet crystal chiming. Blue was crying, something her people claimed was impossible. Hey, Jack said softly, moving to her side. What's wrong? Blue pulled out the notebook they'd been using to communicate. Her crystal hands shook as she drew. First, she showed their warriors finding injured crystal people. Then she drew what happened next. The mercy kills, the way they shattered the wounded to preserve their honor. Jack's face grew hard as he understood. That's why you were so sure they'd kill you. You've seen it happen. He watched as she drew more. Hundreds of broken crystals, all destroyed by their own people. How long has this been happening? Blue drew symbols for time. Thousands of cycles. Generations of crystal people, all killed for being damaged. She had never questioned it until now, until this human had shown her a different way. Is that why you were afraid to accept help at first? Jack asked. Because you'd helped kill others who were hurt. Blue's crystal structure dimmed. Yes, she had been part of it, had believed in the cruel logic of her people. The shame of it made her crystal form ring with a hollow sound. Hey, Jack said, his voice firm but kind. Listen to me. I was in a bad spot once, pinned down by enemy fire. My commander ordered everyone to retreat. But this one Marine, Rita, she came back for me. Disobeyed direct orders. Carried me 3 miles with a broken arm. He smiled at the memory. They wanted to court-martial her. Instead, they gave her a medal. Because sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Blue drew another picture. A question mark next to a broken crystal. And a human figure. Jack nodded, understanding her question. What happens when we reach the base? Well, first we get you to medical. Our doctors have been studying crystal biology since the Alliance. They might not be able to regrow your legs, but... He paused, then drew something in the notebook. A rough sketch of mechanical legs. We've got other options, if you want them. The idea shocked Blue. Artificial additions to crystal forms were forbidden. But then, so was surviving injury. She was already breaking every law of her people just by living. Maybe it was time to break a few more. A distant crystal chime made them both freeze. Through the darkness, Blue could see the glow of crystal warriors on patrol. She reached for the notebook one last time, drawing 2 simple figures standing together. Then she pointed to herself and Jack. Jack smiled. Yeah, partners. Now let's get moving before those patrols spot us. Dawn was approaching when they reached the crossroads. To the east, Blue could see the faint crystalline glow of her people's forward base. To the south lay the human compound, its dark structures barely visible in the distance. Jack set down the travois carefully, checking Blue's crystal structure for any new cracks from their harsh journey. Your choice, he said quietly, looking between the 2 bases. Your people's medical station is closer, probably only 2 hours away. He didn't need to say what would happen if she went there. They both knew the crystal warriors would shatter her, seeing it as a mercy. Blue pulled out their worn notebook, its pages now filled with their shared language of drawings. She sketched quickly. The human base, but with a question mark. Jack understood what she was asking. Best case. Our doctors fit you with mechanical legs. Might take some adjusting, but you walk again. He paused, then continued honestly. Worst case. The surgery doesn't work, but you'd still be alive. Protected. No one would hurt you for being injured. A crystal transport hummed in the distance. Another patrol. They were running out of time. Blue looked toward her people's base, its familiar crystal spires reaching toward the sky. Everything she had ever known was there. Her training, her beliefs, her whole world. She reached for the notebook again, drawing herself with mechanical legs. Then she added something else. Crystal warriors looking angry. Jack nodded grimly. Yeah, your people might see it as an insult, adding artificial parts to a crystal being. They'd probably call it a desecration. The sound of engines made them both look up, but it wasn't crystal transports this time. It was the enemy, their heavy vehicles moving through a valley to the west. Jack checked his map projection, his face going pale. They're launching an attack, he said, watching the enemy forces move. And they're headed straight for the crystal base. He looked at Blue. Your people don't know they're coming. No one's watching that approach. They're all focused on hunting. He trailed off, realizing what he was saying. Blue's crystal structure rang with tension. Her people were in danger, distracted by their hunt for broken warriors like her. She could warn them, save hundreds of lives. But it would mean giving up her own. Jack seemed to read her thoughts. Don't, he said softly. You don't owe them anything. They left you to die. But even as he spoke, he was checking his rifle, ready to support whatever she decided. Blue touched the notebook one last time. She drew two paths diverging. On one path, she drew crystal warriors dying in an ambush. On the other, she drew herself walking on mechanical legs. Then she drew a third path, one where she warned her people, then continued to the human base. Jack studied the drawing. You want to warn them, then run for it. That's cutting it close. The sun will be up soon, and without cooling units. He looked at her damaged crystal structure, then at the enemy forces moving through the valley. But if that's what you want to do, I'm with you. Blue touched his arm, then pointed to the travois. Jack shook his head. No way I'm leaving you. If we're doing this, we do it together. He helped her onto a ridge where she could be seen, then took up a position with his rifle. Just like that first night with the hunters. Light them up. Blue raised her arms, letting her crystal structure shine as brightly as possible. The morning light caught her form, sending flashing beams toward the crystal base. It was a warning signal all crystal warriors knew. Enemy approaching, urgent danger. The response was immediate. Crystal warriors poured from the base, taking defensive positions. The enemy's surprise attack was ruined, but now every crystal warrior could see Blue's broken form shining on the ridge. Time to go, Jack said urgently, already moving to help her. The sun was rising, and the first crystal warriors were heading their way. Blue took one last look at her people's base, then flashed a single bright pulse. Goodbye. As Jack pulled the travois toward the human base, enemy fire and crystal weapons lit up the morning sky behind them. They had chosen their path. Now they just had to survive it. The human doctors moved around Blue with careful precision, their tools designed specifically for crystal biology. It had been 3 weeks since Jack had pulled her through the gates of the human base, both of them half dead from exhaustion. Now she lay on a special cooling pad, watching as they prepared to attach her new legs. Jack stood nearby, still refusing to leave her side. He had received a formal reprimand for abandoning his scouting mission, followed by a commendation for extraordinary service in maintaining alien relations. He had laughed at that, telling Blue it was worth every bit of trouble. Ready? The lead doctor asked, holding up the first mechanical leg. It was beautiful in its own way. Crystal and metal merged together in a design that had taken weeks to perfect. Blue flashed her crystal structure once for yes, their simple communication now adopted by all the medical staff. The procedure took hours. Joining metal to crystal required perfect temperature control and precise calculations. Any mistake could shatter her remaining crystal structure. But human medicine, Blue had learned, was built on second chances and impossible hopes. When it was done, Blue looked down at her new legs. They weren't the pure crystal formation she was born with, but they were something new, a bridge between two worlds. The metal components caught the light differently than crystal, creating patterns she had never seen before. "Want to try standing?" Jack asked, moving to help her. The doctors had warned it would take time to adjust, that she might never move exactly the same way again. But Blue hadn't survived this long by being afraid of change. The first step was strange. Metal and crystal working together in ways her people had never imagined. The second step was easier. By the third, she was starting to understand this new balance. Jack walked beside her, ready to catch her but letting her find her own way. "You're a natural," he said, grinning as she completed a circuit of the medical bay. "Though I guess we need to work on our communication system now that you can walk instead of flash signals." Blue touched her throat where a new universal translator was being designed. The doctors were confident they could modify one to work with her crystal vocal structures. Another change, another bridge between worlds. A commotion outside made them both look up. Through the medical bay windows, they could see crystal warriors approaching the base, not with weapons, but with a formal delegation flag. Jack tensed, but Blue placed a crystal hand on his arm. She recognized the leader, her old commander. The meeting took place in a neutral room. Blue stood on her new legs, Jack beside her, as her commander entered. The crystal warrior stared at Blue's mechanical legs with an unreadable expression. "You violate every law of our people," the commander said through a translator. "You should have died with honor." He paused, then added, "Yet your warning saved many lives. And now you stand before me, proving that perhaps some laws need to be reconsidered." Blue activated the temporary translator they had given her. "I am not what I was," she said, her crystal voice harmonizing with the mechanical device. "But I am more than I could have been." The commander studied her for a long moment. "The council has decided," he said finally. "You will be recorded as dead, as our laws demand. But this," he gestured to her legs, "this experiment in human medicine will be watched with interest." It was more than Blue had hoped for, not acceptance, but observation. A crack in the crystal wall of tradition. After the commander left, Jack turned to her. "So what now?" "The doctors want to study how you adapt to the legs, and there's talk of a joint species medical program." Blue looked down at her new legs, then at the human who had changed everything by refusing to leave her behind. She touched the translator. "Now we build more bridges," she said. "And we show both our peoples that being broken doesn't mean being ended." Jack smiled. "I like that plan, though you're not broken, just different." He gestured to the base around them. "Welcome to your new beginning." Blue took another step with her crystal metal legs, creating new sounds, new patterns, new possibilities. She had lost her old life but found something rare, a chance to change not just herself, but the future of two species. All because one soft, breakable human had been stronger than anyone could have imagined.